Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by sharing a quick story with you. It's about one of my patients that I took care of quite some time ago, back when I was living in Michigan. This gentleman was a middle-aged individual, um, was married, wife, two kids, and an incredibly ambitious individual and dedicated family man. Served his community well, uh, in fact, was a deacon at his church. A very well respected individual in the community. Uh, Quite the provider. He worked for UPS for a number of years and wanted something better for himself and his family. And as a part of that, wanting something better, he was ambitious enough to have this idea of starting a business in the form of a local corner store, essentially. So this individual worked throughout the day, loading and unloading trucks for UPS. And in the evening, he would do things to get his store off the ground. And at one point in time was working two jobs. So this individual was burning the candle at both ends of the stick, as they say. But one thing that was neglected was his health. He was so invested in his family and his community, his church, that he didn't really pay attention to the things that were going on in his body, the things that his body was telling him. This individual had long-standing uncontrolled hypertension, and ultimately it began to affect other organs in the body, including his kidneys. And he ended up with chronic kidney disease that progressed to end-stage renal disease. We'll return to that story here later on, but today I'd like to talk to you guys about strategies in maintaining a healthy heart. Next slide, please. Psalms 51:10 tells us, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." Next slide. So over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about strategies to maintain a clean heart. So what is cardiovascular disease? Cardiovascular disease is a term encompassing diseases which affect the heart or arteries and is characterized by progressive atherosclerosis, resulting in ischemia or infarction of target end organs. So we'll talk about what atherosclerosis, ischemia, and infarction means. Next slide, please. So this is an animation of red blood cells going through a coronary artery, and as it progresses, we see that yellow plaque beginning to narrow that artery, thus limiting blood flow to the heart, or in the case of other organs like the brain, it would be limiting blood flow to the brain. Next slide, please. In this animation, we're going to see the same thing. We see blood cells traveling through the heart. We see the development of this fatty core over time, decades, and we see the lumen or the lining of the vessel get smaller and smaller and smaller. This is coronary artery disease. So we see a thin cap of cells separating the fatty core from the actual lumen. What can happen in the case of a heart attack? There's injury to the lining of that vessel, and when there's injury, platelets and other inflammatory factors come in and block the vessel. Next slide. When this happens, for our more seasoned individuals in the class and on the Zoom call, this is the big one. This is the Fred Sanford big one. Elizabeth, I'm coming to join you, except this is not fake. This is the real deal. Next slide, please. So cardiovascular disease is really an umbrella term. There are a lot of different disease processes that make up this term, including coronary artery disease, peripheral vascular disease, which is blockages of arteries taking blood to the limbs, so the arms and the legs, hypertension or high blood pressure, and cerebral vascular disease, which is obstruction of blood flow in the arteries taking blood to the brain. Did you know that every 40 seconds in America, someone will experience a heart attack? So at the time of this talk, I would estimate that 6 people have had a heart attack just in the short period of time that I've been speaking right now. Same thing with stroke. Every 40 seconds, an American will experience a stroke or cerebrovascular accident. 840,768 people in 2016 died of cardiovascular disease, and that number has increased in the 6 years since this data was published. So it's the #1 cause of death in Americans. So let's talk about racial disparities. So in our community, in the African American community, we see that 41.2% of our population, of our adult population, is afflicted with high blood pressure compared to our Hispanic, Caucasian, and Asian brothers and sisters. Next slide. When we talk about disparities in outcomes between Blacks and whites with diabetes, we see that Blacks have a higher hospitalization rate compared to our white counterparts, and we're less likely to have control of our blood sugars, our cholesterol, and our blood pressure. So this is problematic. When we look at high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke, we see for the most part, all across the board and at all different age ranges, we have higher incidence and prevalence of high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke, even in our younger individuals. And to boot, when we look across the board, our community, the African American community, we're more likely to die at early ages from all causes of things. So we've got a lot of work to do in our community. And one of the things that we're doing right now is what we're doing on this call right now, education. Next slide, please. So it's not all, quote, our fault. There's some social determinants that bear these numbers out. So unemployment, we're more likely to be unemployed. Living in poverty, that goes hand in hand with unemployment. If you're unemployed, if you're living in poverty, you're less likely to be insured. So if we look at the lower left of the screen, could not see an MD. One of the reasons for that would be insurance barriers. Smoking, not being active enough. We'll talk about these things, and obesity in our community as well. Now, all hope is not lost. What we've seen in the data from 1999 to 2015 is that the rates of cardiovascular disease have decreased across the board, but especially in the African American community. We see a 43% decline in the rates of cardiovascular disease over that 16-year period. So we are making some substantial strides in terms of our incidence and prevalence of cardiovascular disease. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease. And I've separated these out into things that we can't change. We can't change, our age, gender, family history, ethnicity, genetic predisposition, or our own prior history of cardiovascular disease. But the take-home point from this is that most of these things we can change. So a few things we can't change, but most of the things we can change, such as our blood pressure, our total cholesterol, our smoking status, our blood sugars, our weight, our body mass index. We can change our activity levels. We can manage our stress better. I wish we could very easily change our income. Social deprivation and our environment. So this is why we're here. We're here to talk about strategies to maintain a healthy heart. By far and away, the #1 thing that we can do to really mitigate or reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease is to stop smoking if we're doing it, right? So this is all forms of smoking. It doesn't matter if you're, a pack a day, half pack a day. Well, Dr. Harder, I only smoke 5 cigarettes a day, or 5 cigarettes, once a week when I'm out hanging with my buddies. Smoking at all, eliminate that, and you'll be well on your way to preventing cardiovascular disease. Exercise regularly. Okay. How many people in this room or on this call are professional athletes? I can tell you guys that no one in this room has raised their hand, right? How many of us think that because we're on our feet all day, that constitutes exercise at work? Well, for those of us who raise our hands, that does not constitute exercise, right? So unless you are a professional athlete, Unless you are a professional athlete or it's your job to train people, you are not getting enough exercise at work. We are clear about that. So what constitutes a regular exercise program? So the recommendations are for 150 minutes at least of moderately intense aerobic exercise per week, or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic exercise per week. Next slide. What does this look like? So moderately intense exercise feels somewhat hard. So you're able to do it. You're able to carry on a conversation, but probably not sing along to the music that you're listening to. Your respiratory rate increases, but you're not short of breath. It's something that you can maintain for a long period of time. Maybe you break out into a light sweat after about 10 minutes. So if you want to get more technical about it, we can define moderately intense exercise as exercise that achieves 50 to 70% of your peak heart rate. Dr. Hardaway, how do we figure out the peak heart rate? The peak heart rate varies with age. So if you take the number 220 and subtract your age, that is what we call your maximally predicted heart rate. So we'll use an example here, and we'll make the math easy by using a 60-year-old woman. So 220 minus 60 equals 160. So for this 60-year-old woman, 160 beats per minute would be the maximal predicted heart rate. If we multiply that by 50%, so 50% of 160 is 80 beats per minute. And then if we also multiply that by 70%, 70% of 160 is 112 beats per minute. So moderately intense exercise for this particular 60-year-old woman will be any aerobic activity that allows her heart rate to get between 80 and 112 beats per minute, okay? So intense exercise, or that vigorous exercise, would be 80% or more, being able to sustain that for 30 minutes. And once again, the recommendation is 150 minutes of moderately intense exercise per week, however you do it, separate it out, over 3 days, 5 days, or what have you, or vigorous aerobic exercise, 75 minutes per week. All right, number 3, lower your cholesterol. In order to lower your cholesterol, you should know what it is, right? So that's number 1. So how do we figure out what our cholesterol is? Well, you go to your physician, you go to health fairs like this, and you get a spot check, essentially. So it's not enough just to know the total cholesterol, right? Because there's good cholesterol that adds to the total, there's bad cholesterol, there's triglycerides. So triglycerides, bad. Next, please. HDL, that's your good cholesterol, okay? And then your LDL, which is probably the most important one that we look at. So that's a bad cholesterol. Next slide, please. So the best way to lower your cholesterol it would be through diet and exercise. That's our first step. If you come and see me or any of my colleagues and we see that you have elevated cholesterol, we're going to talk to you about your diet. We're going to talk to you about your activity levels. And if those are not up to snuff, we're going to ask you to adopt a regular exercise program. We're going to talk to you about changing your diet. But if that does not work, then medications are going to be the way to go, right? So I'm not here to pound the table and preach about taking a whole bunch of pills. The take-home point is a lot of these things we can do without having to go the medication route, right? So diet, exercise, stop smoking, making sure that those things are up to par. So medications would be indicated if you are not able to lower your cholesterol with diet and exercise, and you have a history of a cardiovascular event, meaning a heart attack, a stroke, or a mini stroke. If you're an adult over the age of 21 years old and you have a really, really high LDL, that's bad cholesterol, remember? Or if you're between the ages of 40 and 75 with an LDL between 70 and 189 and a 7.5% risk of heart attack or stroke in 10 years, you don't have to figure that out. That's what the healthcare professionals are there to do. So you guys don't have to remember that. Or if you're diabetic with an LDL between 70 and 189 and you're between 40 and 75 years old. Once again, you don't have to worry about remembering that. That's what the healthcare professionals are there for. So why is that important? Because we know that in combination with things like smoking, high blood pressure, having an elevated LDL or an unfavorable cholesterol panel, those things significantly increase your risk of stroke, heart attack, mini stroke, the development of peripheral arterial disease. Control your diabetes, right? So number one, you need to see a healthcare provider to be screened for diabetes, right? In the case of the patient that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, that was an individual, who was so really just caught up um, in providing for his family, being a service to his church and the surrounding community, that really didn't really take care of himself. A selfless individual, but it obviously is important to take care of yourself. So get screened for diabetes. And if you are diabetic, you got to make sure that your blood sugars are under good control, because diabetes is a huge risk factor for the development of coronary disease, which is blockages in the coronary arteries, heart attack, stroke, mini stroke. So if you are diabetic, your target hemoglobin A1C, if you are diabetic, you know what the hemoglobin A1C is already, is less than 7%. The lower, the better, okay? Now, what if your A1C is really high? Let's say it's 13%, right? And it gets better, it drops down to 10%. You say, man, I had a 3% decrease, I'm so much better. It's not enough, if you need to, lean on your doctor, lean on your healthcare provider to say, hey, I know my A1C is better, but I went to this PIPCO healthcare pair and they told me I got to get it less than 7%. So I'm not satisfied with it being 10%. Okay. So don't rest on that. You need to get it as close to normal and maintain it as close to normal as possible. Control your blood pressure. So a number of years ago, we defined high blood pressure as a top number or systolic number of 140 or more and a bottom number of 90 or more. But since then, the definition has been redefined. We discovered that that 140 over 90 was an inadequate target. So we're much more aggressive about our blood pressure thresholds. It's now defined as 130 over 80, okay? I'll talk about this here in a couple of minutes. Next, racial differences in high blood pressure. Once again, and we kind of talked about this earlier, in our community, in the African-American community, you see much higher rates of hypertension in our community for reasons that we talked about previously. Next slide. We see a normal blood pressure is a top number or systolic of 120 millimeters mercury or less, bottom number of 80 millimeters mercury or less, elevated at 120 over 129. Normally, or in years previous, we look at that and say, okay, this is not bad, but we want to get much more aggressive with regard to our blood pressure control. As I said in the last slide, our new definition, if we look at stage 1 hypertension, 130 to 139 over 80 to 89, and then frank blood pressure, stage 2, 140 or higher, 90 or higher. Now, at what level do we need to start considering medications? If after adopting a regular exercise program and a strict diet, mainly limiting your sodium intake, we'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes as well. If your blood pressure is still elevated, and in cases it will be, then in those situations, we need to entertain the initiation of medications. Control your weight. If only it was this easy and this fast as this slide shows us. So, so one of the things that we look at in terms of weight is something called the body mass index. It is a somewhat flawed system, but as it stands right now, it's one of the better tools that we have. The reason I say it's flawed, we all know who Arnold Schwarzenegger is or Ronnie Coleman. These are, professional or formerly professional bodybuilders, just big, bulky men, just, muscles, to beat the band. When those individuals were at the height of their weightlifting, of their bodybuilding, these individuals were technically considered obese, super obese. They had a body mass index of 35, 36, but pretty much 5% body fat. So that's what makes this system a bit flawed. Now, granted, not very many of us, including myself, are bodybuilders, right? So, and individuals like myself, this does apply. All right, so we want to keep our body mass index below 25. Obese would be considered over 30, and your healthcare provider will be able to let you know whether or not you're obese or not. Obviously, obesity contributes to the development of cardiovascular disease. Next slide, please. How do we lose weight? Just simply put, weight loss occurs when you burn more calories than you take in. That's the simplest equation. Myself as a cardiologist, and I'm sure some of you guys have heard the same thing. Doc, it's really tough for me to lose weight. I get it. It's tough to, decrease your calorie intake. It's tough to increase your burn capacity, essentially. But the simple equation is you burn more calories via your activities of daily living and exercise more than you take in. All right, next slide. So eat smart. So this is probably the toughest thing for all of us to do. Let's talk about the facts on that. So we see love it, limit it, or lose it. So some of the things, the fats that we love come in the form of olive oils, avocados, fish, some healthy nuts, peanuts, almonds, cashews. We want to really limit the fat that we get from bacon. So limit the fat that we get from bacon, certain cheese, heavy creams, and butter. And we want to really completely eliminate the fats that we get from donuts and cakes and pies, that kind of thing. Maybe special occasions, but it should not be obviously a routine part of our diet. Next slide, please. Go fish. Eat fish at the very least twice a week. Fish is you get your meat crave, or you satisfy your meat craving with fish. Things like albacore tuna, salmon, lake trout. These are excellent sources of the so-called omega-3 fatty acids, which will lower your triglycerides, lower your bad cholesterol, and raise your good cholesterol. So eat more fish. Next slide. Be nutty. We talked about this a couple of seconds ago. Almonds, cashews, pistachios, excellent sources of the essential fats, the healthy fats, so to speak. They are calorie dense, but it only takes a handful with the fat consistency of it, it will satisfy you. So you don't have to eat the whole bag or anything like that to get full. Next slide, please. Add avocado to your meals. I'm not a big avocado eater personally, but it is very good for you. So, and it's filling as well. So by doing that, you get your healthy fats in, you're full, so your total calorie consumption goes down as a part of that as well. Check the oils: avocado oils, canola oil, corn seed olive oil. These are the good oils that we should be cooking with. Okay. Next slide. And then we'll move on to salt. And I think it's best to address the salt myths that are out there. Next slide. Eliminate sodium completely from your diet for good health. That is a myth. Number one, it's impossible to do. You need it, but you don't need a whole lot of it, right? So salt intake increases your risk of high blood pressure, fluid retention, and certain disease states like heart failure. It can be very detrimental, but this is a myth. You can't. If you eat anything, you're going to have some sodium in it. The thing we should do is really try to limit our sodium intake to about 1,500 milligrams per day. Really, really tough to do. Sea salt has less sodium than table salt. That too is a myth. I don't know where we got that sea salt is more healthy for you. But that's not the case at all. Salt is salt. Sodium chloride salt is salt, and we should continue to try to limit it as much as we can. Next slide. Dr. Hardaway, I usually don't salt my food, so I don't eat too much sodium, right? Wrong, right? There are a lot of hidden sources of sodium in the foods that we eat, and we'll talk about that here in the next coming slides. Next slide, please. High level of sodium are found only in food. That's not true. We get some of it in some of our pill preparations. But if we're being really good about it, we won't have to be on pills, right? If we're really tight and strict on our diet and our exercise routine, we should be okay. Next slide, please. Lower sodium foods have zero taste. It's so bland. Well, I would challenge that. If you talk to any amateur or professional chef, they'll tell you can season your foods very nicely with with non-salt based seasoning. So Mrs. Dash, you can use pepper, certain spices and herbs. So there are other ways to enhance the flavor of your food outside of salt. Next slide, please. Dr. Hardaway, my blood pressure is normal, so I don't need to worry about how much sodium I eat. That's false, right? If you want to maintain a normal blood pressure, the best thing for you to do, in addition to diet, exercise, would be to continue to limit your salt intake, 1,500 milligrams per day. Next slide, please. And the seventh myth, I don't eat a lot of salty food, so I don't eat too much sodium, but as we see, there's a good amount of sodium in things like bread, right? You take a slice of bread, you eat it. Most of us wouldn't think about that bread tasting salty, but if you read the labels, you can get a good amount of it there. Cheese as well, and also unseasoned poultry, right? Next slide. We'll skip this slide as well. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at this nutrition label here, we see 120 calories. And if we go down to sodium, 490 milligrams of sodium per serving for this particular food. Which one do you think it is? You think it's whole milk, cottage cheese, ranch dressing, canned olives? Which one? All right, we got a vote for dressing. Olives, okay. Anyone else? All right, let's see what the answer is. Cottage cheese. Believe it or not, cottage cheese. Loaded with sodium, 490 milligrams in one serving. One serving is just a half a cup of cottage cheese. Yeah, absolutely. So these are the hidden sources of salt. Next slide, please. How much sodium you think is in this Popeye's chicken sandwich that you had last night for dinner? 1,500? Over 1,500? Let's see. Survey says 1,473 milligrams of sodium in this Popeye's chicken sandwich that somebody had for lunch yesterday. All right. And remember, we want to limit it to 1,500 milligrams per day. Next slide, please. 42 grams of fat. Good gracious. Next slide. And if you continue to eat like that, you'll have the big one, just like our guy, Fred Sanford. Next slide, please. So some take-home points. Next slide. So stop smoking today, right now. Exercise, remember, moderately intense exercise, 150 minutes per week, or 75 of vigorous exercise. Know your cholesterol, control your cholesterol. Prevent diabetes, control your diabetes. Check your blood pressure and control your blood pressure, and really be insistent with your primary care provider that these measures are met, right? It's not enough to be, okay, yeah, my blood pressure is still a little bit elevated, I'm on medications, but my primary care physician or provider is not terribly concerned about it. Insist that your blood pressure is controlled, insist that your blood sugars are controlled, insist that your cholesterol is controlled. Achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. We talked about that with the body mass index. Eat smart, be healthy. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of the conversation, I've talked to you guys about a patient that I took care of a number of years ago. This is a picture of me with said individual. If you think we look alike, this is my father, this is my dad. So my dad developed, as I said, developed end-stage renal disease and went on to receive a kidney transplant. It'll be 16 years this Father's Day weekend. I'm happy to report that he's alive and doing very well. He has since changed his tune. He's still selfless, still an ambitious individual, but he really takes care of himself at this point in time. Watches his diet, stops smoking, and is still the loving individual that raised me from a little kid, from a baby, essentially. Next slide. I'll leave you guys with this, Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for it's the wellspring of life. Thank you guys for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. That's a great question. You're in a different situation because you've had your event. That now we're in the secondary prevention phase of this right now. So I would imagine and I'm just speaking generically here, I would imagine you're on medications to help uh, 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 reduce your subsequent risk of having a heart attack, in addition to the things that you're doing at home in terms of diet and the regular exercise. But the short answer to your question is that as we do age, our risk does continue to go up. But if you're controlling things like your blood pressure, if you're controlling things like your LDL, and you're on some of the all of the necessary secondary prevention medications, aspirin, that kind of thing, making sure that your blood sugars are okay and that you're not developing pre-diabetes or frank diabetes, you should be okay.
I've been in conversations with a friend of mine, and we will argue about the fact that, okay, we're taking medication, blood pressure, cholesterol, all of that, and she just eats and does anything because she has the medication, and she feels that she won't be negatively impacted because she's taking medication, but she's still doing all these other bad habits that she feels is gonna, medicine's gonna wipe that away. Could you speak to
Absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. So let's say your friend has high blood pressure and says, well, I've got my, taking medications to help me with my blood pressure, but she's still doing all the other things that you said that she's doing. So that's going to require a higher dose of blood pressure medication, right? So we live under the mantra, we operate under the mantra that, number one, if you don't need to be on medications, we're not going to put you on it, right? But if you do need to be on medication, we're going to try to use the lowest effective dose for it. All medications have potential side effects, right? So the higher the dose, the more likelihood that individuals experience side effects. Now, the other thing too, though, we can't really negate the importance of the diet and the exercise with this, right? So using the medications kind of just, I don't want to say puts a Band-Aid on the problem, but if we're talking about whole body health, diet and exercise is the way to go. It's the easiest thing to do, but it's the hardest thing to do, right? Because we don't want to do it. We want to go to Popeyes for lunch. We want to sleep in. We don't want to wake up and do the hard thing. We don't want to get up and stretch and get our jog in or our treadmill walk in or what have you, right? Because those things can be hard. But if we think about it, and we want to avoid or give ourselves the best shot at avoiding having to take medications, these are the things that we got to do.